So now it's time to build the plugin and obviously our page markup so we can actually test that this works. So the first thing that we're going to do is just build the form out just so we have the structure there that we need to test this. So I'm going to create a form here with a post method. So we've got a action, which is where your form will be submitted through to sign the user up or do whatever you're doing in this form. And we've got a method of post here. This here has got nothing to do with the jQuery plugin. This can be get, which it wouldn't be if you were submitting a sign up, but you get the picture. This doesn't really matter. This has no sort of relation to the actual checking of fields for existence in the database. So inside of the form, we're going to create a div called form field, and this is purely just to split up both the form fields so this doesn't sit in line. You might be using a front-end framework or something to put together your forms, whatever it is. I'm just using this to separate both of these out. So within here, we're going to contain the username, and the other one, we're going to contain the email. So what I'm going to do is create a label here, and this is going to be for username. So we'll name our field with an ID of username. And in here, we'll just say choose a username. So that looks like, if we just head over to our index page, that looks like that. So after this, we need the actual input itself. So we have an input with a type of text. The name is going to be the name that's submitted through to signup.php. Again, this has nothing to do with our plugin. The ID is going to be username, essentially, so when we click on this label here, this is ready to input. Oh, by the way, I'm just going to turn autocomplete off of here just so we don't get suggestions pop up. And more importantly, on our input, we want to add a class. And this is the class that we're going to identify or select and then apply our plugin to. So I'm going to call this check exist. You can call this anything you want, it doesn't matter. What I'm then going to do is use a data attribute to supply or sort of specify the type of this field. Remember, that's the same as when we do, let me just duplicate this, when we do this, so type equals username. We already have this functionality. So that is the type that we're going to send through to that file. And what we then want is we want a span element at the end of this with a class of check exists feedback. Now I'm going to hard code this selector into our jQuery plugin, so you might want to change this around and add this just so it's a little bit more flexible. You'll see what we mean later, but either way, it's going to work for now. It just might not be entirely flexible. And we're going to have the same data type, data attribute on here, so we can pinpoint this specific span in order to enter some text. So essentially, this will inject text into here, so it'll be something like that is not available, or whatever you want to enter in there, and that will look like that. So we've got that now for our username. What I'm now going to do is just duplicate this form field div with everything contained inside of it, and I'm going to say enter your email, and then here we're going to give this a name of email, that email. So basically just replacing everything. So really then, once we've finished our plugin, if you want to create a new one, you just have to duplicate and it will just automatically work. That's our sort of goal here. And then we're going to have an input type of submit with just sign up. This is, this is a useless button. We're not going to be building this sign up page. So now we're at the point where I can start typing my username in. I can start typing my email address in. But now we want the functionality to, as this is being typed, we're going to set interval to hit with an Ajax request our check.php page, sending this data, and then we'll report back to the user whether this exists or not. So the first thing that we need to do is load in jQuery. So if you head over to Google hosted libraries, you can just quickly grab a copy of this from served from Google's content delivery network. So I'm going to load in version 2 here. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to, at the bottom of my page, just before my ending body, create a script element with a source attribute, and I'm going to paste that in. Now this means serve over HTTP and HTTPS depending on which protocol is used, but I'm going to change this to HTTP since I'm working locally, but you might want to keep it as just the // Now what we also want to do is include a JavaScript file of our own, so let's create another script element with a source attribute, and we need to create this JavaScript file. Typically these are found within a JS folder or something like that. So there's my JS folder within the directory I'm working in, and I'm going to create a new file within this, and I'm going to name that main.js. You might want to call this something like existcheck.jQuery.js. In fact, we could probably do that if we wanted to be honest. And this would be our sort of plugin file that we load in. And then down here, what we're going to do is we're going to activate this plugin. And you'd want to do this in a separate file as well, your sort of main JavaScript file. So we've got our file specifically dedicated to our plugin, and then we've got our scripts on page here, which we're going to use to actually activate this plugin. So let's just quickly load this in. So exists check.jQuery.js. And just to make sure this is loaded in, if you really want to check, you just do a console log of 1 and then refresh. Now I'm going to be using the console very sort of closely in this video, as well as the network tab as well, so we can see how many requests are being made to our check page, as well as actually checking what's been sent with them requests. And you can see in the console we're logging 1, so we know that that file is loaded in properly. So the first thing to do then is just start to build out the plugin, and then we will use it on the elements with a class of check exists, and we'll just take it from there. So let's start to build this plugin then. Now jQuery has a function object which allows us to create a new function, if you like, which essentially would be a jQuery plugin, because what happens is when we extend when we do a selector for exists, is it check exists? Yeah, check exists. And when we do dot something, this returns the jQuery object, which then in turn has access to the function object. So we use $2, which is basically just a shorthand for jQuery object, and then we say .fn, and then we give our plugin a name. So I'm going to call this exists checker, and this is going to equal a function like this, and then we just end that down there. So there we go. So this is now our function. If I was to do a console log of 1 in there, and I was to say check exists, so check exists here and check exists here, these are both classes on both of them inputs, dot exists checker, then that's then going to console log because we're making use of that plugin. However, what we're not doing is we're not applying this to both of these elements. So what we actually need to do inside of our plugin is we need to return this.each, and then in here we have a closure. And then we do all of the code in here that relates to checking. And that means that this applies to both them fields. So when I refresh now, you can see that this little circle has a 2 in, which means that this has been console logged twice, 1 for each of these fields. If, for example, we were to have a third field, so if I were to just paste that down there, that does it 3 times, but we're not going to do that, we'll just have 2. So now that this is being run for each of them fields, we can start to write out the code that we need. Now we're going to be storing an interval, because what we're going to do is, as a user is typing, we're going to start an interval, which is going to check every 2 seconds for the data, and it's going to send a request every 2 seconds, only if that data has not changed. So this means that instead of making a request to our backend every time a user hits a key, we're just going to do it every 2 seconds, as long as the value doesn't remain the same. And this just means that we send slightly less requests to our server, and therefore it's more likely to be a little bit quicker. So I'm going to store the interval here. And we'll look at this more in a minute if that doesn't make sense. So we're going to say this, which refers to the object that we're currently selecting. So this basically. This in here refers to these. In this case, it's this and this. So we're going to say this dot on, and we're going to add an event handler here. So on key up, we're going to run whatever's in this function. So if I just do a console log here, and I just say typed, or I'll just say key up, then every time now I type something in here, you can see that that's being added to. That's console logging key up. So I can keep typing, I can keep typing here, and you can see that for every time I type, that is running that function. So obviously if we would send an Ajax request to the server every time we pressed a key, you can imagine now we would have sent 29 requests, which is ridiculous. And this is a lot of these tutorials that teach doing this actually do take that approach, which is quite bad. So what we're going to do now is we're going to grab all of the information related to what we've typed, what the user's typed, then we'll start to set the interval. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to store this as self. I'm going to store another variable, and I'm comma separating these here rather than doing vars on each line. It's entirely up to you which method you take. I'm going to say self type. Now how do we get which type this is? So for this one, as the jQuery plugin looks at this one, we know that the type is a username, and we've defined that using a data attribute. Now jQuery gives us a handy data method which allows us to pull in this really easily. So I can just do self.data, and then I can define that. So data type. So data type. So let me just do a console log on self type and refresh. There we go. So we're just outputting username. When I do it in here, we're outputting email. So we know that we, for each of these, have the access to the type. Now we want the value, which is a little bit easier to understand. So we say self value, but we're not going to be storing that just yet. We'll store that within the interval itself. And that will become clear why we're doing that later on. But we are going to define the variable up here because we define all of our variables, whether or not they have a value, at the top of each function. That's just best practice. So we now need to define where this feedback is. So the feedback is that check exists feedback class with a specific data type. So in here we're going to do a selector. We're going to say check exists feedback, and in here we're going to say data type equals, and then in here we're going to concatenate on the data type. Oops, sorry, these need to be single quotes like that. So in here we're going to say self type. So now this feedback is a selector, a jQuery selector for the feedback element. So now what I can do to test this is say feedback.text 1. So that means that for each item I type in, you can see 1 just appeared there. And I can do the same here, 1 just appeared there. So we know that that works now. And there are probably much better ways to do this. You could even pass options through to your plugin to define what the class name is here, because technically this is bad practice. We're hard coding it in. But I'll leave that up to you to go ahead and change this maybe to make it a little bit more flexible. If you wanted to change the class name within your markup, you would have to modify the plugin. And I'll purposely leave that in for you to go and refactor. It still works fine, but you can go ahead and change that. So now what we want to do is actually look at starting this interval. So we're going to create an if statement here to check if the interval is undefined, because what we don't want to do is keep creating an interval every time a user keys up. So we're going to say interval triple equals for type comparison undefined. So if the interval is undefined, we then want to set the interval. Remember, if it's not defined, we don't need to reset the interval because it'll already be going. And if you're not too sure, a JavaScript interval is just a function that will run every amount of milliseconds that you give it. So for example, I could say, well, I want a function to run 100 milliseconds, which is obviously a tenth of a second. So we're going to assign interval. Remember, we applied this up here. So we're doing this outside key up because we don't want to keep redefining this here. So interval equals set interval, and set interval will take, first of all, a closure, which is just a function here, and as its second argument, we'll take the amount of time you want to, or the interval basically. So I'm going to say 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log. Let's console log something out like self.value. This is, remember, this self value here, which will store inside of here in a moment. But either way, just know that this gets the value of what you've typed inside of one of these boxes. So in here, we're going to say Alex, and you'll see that interval has now started, and every 2 seconds, it's console logging that value. So we're going to use this if the value hasn't changed to do an Ajax request to the server. And it's the same for this value here as well. If I was to type alex at codecourse.com, you can see that that's now console logging that value out. And it's also doing that first one as well. So it's simultaneously checking. But at the moment, if we were to leave this as it is and do an Ajax request, we'd be just constantly polling the server for this value. Now, why would we need to constantly poll for the same value? It's pointless. If Alex is typed there and they've not changed anything since the last interval, then we don't need to send the request again because nothing's changed. So inside of here, we want to say, let's just pull this down a little bit, if self value doesn't equal self.val. Now that might seem a bit confusing at the moment, but inside of here what we're then going to do is set self value to self.val. So what's going to happen now is down here we can do our Ajax request. So if I were to do a console log of self value here, let's now see the difference between what we've just seen. I'm going to type Alex in there. You can see that's going to send a request, or we're not actually sending an Ajax request, but that's console logged Alex. Now, what's actually happening is in the background, we've still got the interval running every 2 seconds, but it's only if I change the value that it does another request. If I get rid of it, it's now going to do another request. But we are going to prevent against that because we want our username to be more than 2 characters, so 3 or more characters long. So we're now more efficiently sending a request to the backend rather than doing it every single time the user is typing or putting a key down. So let's get rid of that console log. Hopefully that makes sense now. Let's do a little if statement here to check the length of the value. So self-value.length. We need to make sure that's greater than 2. So only if the value is greater than 2, we're actually going to send an Ajax request to the server. Because, I mean, you can change this around yourself, but it really depends on the requirements of your username. So now that we've done that, we're actually going to do our Ajax request. So we use jQuery's Ajax method and we pass an object in here. And this has all sorts of things like callbacks, properties that we send along, etc. So the first property that we're going to define is the URL that we want to send the data to. Now we know this is check.php, we know that we need to send a type, and we know that we need to send a value in order to determine whether that username exists or not. So let's type in here check.php. So we now need to define, well, we don't need to, but we can define the type of request. In this case, it's going to be a GET request. Remember, we're picking values up using the GET superglobal. And we, again, don't need to because jQuery is clever enough to do this, but we can define the data type that we're expecting back from the request. In this case, I'm going to define that it's JSON, but it should pick this up if you don't supply these. I always like to supply these because it's easier for other developers or yourself in the future to see what kind of request you're sending and which kind of data you're expecting back. And now we want to define actually the data that we're sending along. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit and I'm going to send along the type. This here is what we're expecting here. So type, we know the type, we know that that's stored in self type up here, so we can just say self type, and then we comma separate and we say value, self value, easy as that, and that's again this here. So as long as there was a successful request to this, a callback is called and we run this function. Now, if the request failed for any reason, we have this error callback. So something went wrong, and you can handle that in your own way. I won't do anything here, and if it does fail, it will just silently fail, and I don't really see a problem with that, because at the end of the day the user will just then submit the form and then get your backend validation working anyway. So success, what we also additionally have within this callback is an argument called data, or not called data, but we're going to call it data. So let's do a console log on data. Now this is really interesting, because this is the point where we start to see our code working. We've got our success callback with our data. Let's check that we get that exists back from the server like we've seen here. So let me choose a username. I'm going to type in Alex. We know that that doesn't exist. We know that does exist. So here you can see that we've logged an object. Remember I said earlier that when we pull this data in, because it's a data type of JSON, jQuery will automatically parse this for you. Traditionally, we would have to do json.parse and then pass in the data, and maybe just reassign that or something so we got the object. But jQuery has automatically parsed this, and now you can see that we're getting this object. So what I can actually do is I can then access this exists key here, or property. So that says exists true. What happens if I add more to this? It says exists false. So we're getting this feedback here, which we can then use to add our little message on the end there. The same with the email as well. If I just start typing alex@codecourse.com, you can see that that says exists true. So I could then go ahead and maybe change that, and then we get exists false. So we're doing our requests now. For all of that data, we've only made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 requests to the server, which isn't bad at all. And it appears that everything's working. So we've now successfully tied up our backend to our front end. But we're not quite finished there, because we need to apply this feedback text. So in here, we first want to make sure that the exists property is available. So remember this here. We need to make sure that is available first of all. So we just do data.exist. So we're using the dot notation to access the exists property. And we're going to say if that's not undefined. Simple as that. So does that exist property exist? And then if it does, we can just say if data.exists equals true. So if that's true, then that means that the username or email or whatever other field that you're using this for is taken. Now we need to set this feedback text here next to this. We already have a selector for this up here, remember? So all we need to do is say feedback.text already taken. Simple as that. Otherwise, we're going to assume that it's available. You might also want you might want to do an else if here, and say else if data.exists equals false. But we can safely assume that if it's not true, then it is going to be false. So I'm just going to leave that as an else. So feedback.text that is available. So we've already seen this working, so it's nothing new. But now, when I type in Alex, it says, already taken. I can change that to Dale. That is available. You'll notice we've got a very slight delay on this. That's just because we have that 2-second delay. Depending on how you're accessing your data in your backend, maybe it's optimized with some kind of indexed service, you could change this to maybe shorter. However, in your network tab, you can keep track of how many requests are being sent, by the way. If I was to type that and it says already taken, let's go over to XHR here. And our filter, you can do all if you want, but this just filters out our Ajax requests. Then you can see that we're perhaps making a few more requests than we really need. So if I was to start typing here, then in total for these two, we've made quite a few requests. It really depends, as I said, on how this is set up. And there probably are better ways to detect whether the user's finished typing. But really, for a very small project like this, it's with not very many users, and by that I mean thousands. It's fine. Okay, so we have now actually finished building this functionality, and the best thing about this is it's flexible. So I can work with a username field, I can work with my email field as we've seen here. And then the user can hit sign up, and remember, you've got your backend validation on there as well. So that's how we check if data exists using an Ajax request, and we've built a reusable jQuery plugin.